First of all, I want to thank everybody who is participating today. This is a really exceptional person that we can listen to speak. It's a really incredible opportunity to hear about a topic that's not only important to us here at, but should be prioritized throughout our entire industry. We're grateful today to have Richard Rothstein. He's a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, Thurgood Marshall Institute, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and part of the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley. As you know, he's an author, and we're excited to hear him speak about his book, The Color of Law. It's a forgotten history of our government, of how our government segregated America. And to be honest, though I'm aware of some aspects of redlining, things that happened in Chicago, it wasn't until his book and another article I read in Bloomberg, I was unaware of, federal and local governments and their funding for creating neighborhoods that still exist today that are segregated. And although we still have a lot of inequality and bias, it's very clear. Understanding the policy and laws and the funding that created segregation is astounding. So I think you will learn a lot from listening to him. And I think that it's really fundamentally important for all of us to understand how we got to where we are today with segregation in America and the neighborhoods that we have. And if you understand how the law is imposed and how it was funded, I think people will view the issues that we have today and the inequality very differently. So thank you, Richard, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Thad. And thanks to all of you for joining me today for this conversation. As you all know, we had a civil rights movement in this country in the 20th century. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, and then it went on to challenge it in colleges and universities. And then that led, as you know, to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, in which the Supreme Court prohibited ongoing legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown decision gave impetus and stimulation, inspiration to a movement of activists. They engaged in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that struggle. Some were seriously injured. You may recall, not so long ago, we spent a good bit of time memorializing the life of John Lewis, who was very severely injured in a number of those demonstrations, including one simply to try to get voting rights. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement, with its activism, succeeded in desegregating public accommodations, restaurants, hotels, public transportation, employment. And then in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting a law passed, the Fair Housing Act, that you're all familiar with, that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And that Fair Housing Act did nothing, though, to end the segregation that existed. We left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in was clearly defined areas of that was either all white and mostly white, clearly defined areas that were either all black or mostly black. The civil rights movement had mostly persuaded the country that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy, and yet we left untouched the biggest segregation of all. How could that be? Well, partly it's because once we create segregation, desegregating is hard. We pass a law prohibiting the segregation of restaurants, and the next day, anyone can go to any restaurant. We pass a law prohibiting the segregation of neighborhoods, and the next day, things would look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, Northerners, Southerners, Democrats, Republicans, what we've done is adopted a national rationalization. an excuse we give ourselves for failing to redress the biggest segregation of all. Well, the excuse, the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges and universities and public accommodations and transportation, the things we abolished in the 20th century, that was all done by government. If we pass a law prohibiting segregation in restaurants that was created by government, government requires us to end that segregation because it was a civil rights violation. But the segregation in neighborhoods, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by law, by ordinance, by public policy of any kind. That just sort of happened naturally. It happened, because bigoted white landlords or homeowners wouldn't sell to African Americans in Black neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves it happened because of private businesses, banks, realtors, developers discriminating in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe we say it happened because of self-choice. It's become a very popular explanation lately. People just like to live with each other of the same race. That's why we're segregated. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's because of income differences, economic trends. So African Americans on average have lower incomes than whites. They can't afford, in many cases, in most cases, to move to higher opportunity communities. All of these individual, bigoted, private sector, self-choice, economic differences is what's created residential segregation. And we comfortably tell ourselves what happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We may think it's too bad. We may think it's too bad to live in an apartheid society. But what happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. What happened accident can only unhappen by accident. Well, I spent most of my career not writing about this topic. I was an education policy analyst, studying public education. I was the education columnist for the New York Times. I wrote a column there. I was a policy writer for a research institute in Washington on education policy. I came to understand that in the 1990s and 2000s, the education policy that we were following as a nation made no sense. At the time, we believed we had an achievement gap, what we call an achievement gap between Black and white students. African American children achieve at lower levels than white children. And we reasoned, and I'm talking about a broadly across the political spectrum, we reasoned the reason we have this achievement gap, the reason that Black children achieve at lower levels than white children, is because the teachers of Black children just don't try very hard. They're lazy. Maybe they're bigoted. And if only we could make teachers try harder, we said, the achievement gap would disappear. So we passed a law in 2001, broadly supported Democrats and Republicans across the political spectrum. We passed a law requiring that children be tested every year, that those scores be reported by race every year. And we said that would shame teachers who would see that Black children were achieving at lower levels than white children. It would shame them into trying harder, and the achievement gap would disappear. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's the law we passed. The law predicted that the achievement gap would disappear in 7 years. We're now 20 years out. The achievement gap is about as much as it was then. The only thing that law accomplished was that it gave schools an incentive to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and focus all their attention on drilling children to achieve higher scores in math and reading tests. Well, I understood and I wrote that that's not the reason for the achievement gap. This law is based on a flawed theory. We held, of course, there are some teachers who are lazy, some teachers who are bigoted. That's not the reason we have an achievement gap. The reason we have an achievement gap is because so many Black children come to school with serious social and economic disadvantages that impedes their ability to take advantage of what good schools have to offer. So, for example, I remember writing one column about asthma. As you may know, African American children in urban areas have asthma by as much as 4 times the rate as middle-class children. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. The reason they have asthma at such a high rate is because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more industry close by, more trucks driving by their homes, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more dust from abandoned lots. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely, not in every case, but more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma, to be up at night wheezing and then come to school drowsy the next day. And I tried to explain, if you have 2 groups of children, identical in every respect, same social and economic background, same family structure, same economic circumstances, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement simply because it's drowsier. And no matter how hard the teacher works, the teacher can't make a child less drowsy if they've been up at night wheezing. Well, asthma doesn't make a big difference in student achievement. It's a small contribution. But then you begin to think of all of the other social and economic challenges that low-income, disproportionately African-American, come to school with that impede their ability to learn. Asthma, lead poisoning has a measurable harmful effect on IQ. The most aggressive teacher in the world can't raise a child's IQ simply by trying harder. Homelessness, economic insecurity, you begin to add all these up and pretty much you've explained the achievement gap between Black and white children. It's not that lazy teachers don't exist. They may contribute a little bit, but the most important contributor are these social and economic challenges. Well, it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. What happens if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges? How can such a school ever expect to achieve at the same level on average as a school where children come well-rested, well-nourished from economically secure homes in good health? You can't have that expectation no matter how many laws you pass demanding it. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with those kinds of disadvantages. We call them segregated schools. Schools are more segregated today than they have been in the last 45 years. And the reason they're more segregated is the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So as an education policy writer, I began to think that maybe residential segregation was an education policy issue, something I ought to look into. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. It involved 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of them had very, very trivial school desegregation plans. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the parent's choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of a child who would help to desegregate the school. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, one place left in that school, both a Black and a white child applied for that last remaining place, Black child would be given some preference, help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial program, excuse me, but the Supreme Court denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing, said it was unconstitutional. The opinion was written by Chief Justice Roberts. The Chief Justice explained, he says, true, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated, but he said, they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. He was right about that. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods are segregated de facto, just in fact, not in law. Government had nothing to do with segregating those neighborhoods. It was done because of private bigotry and actions of private businesses like yours, people wanting to live with each other of the same race, income differences. And he said, well, you have segregation that wasn't created by government. Government is prohibited under the Constitution from fixing it. Well, I read this decision. As I said, it was based on 2 school districts, Seattle, Washington, Louisville, Kentucky. And I remembered something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky some years before. There was a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. That homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife, child, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in his suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. When the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop that. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence for sedition the white homeowner. Sedition for selling a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the courts, the criminal justice system, these are agents of state government. This is a 14th Amendment violation, something that we have an obligation as American citizens to remedy, but we never have done. And then I looked into it further, and I found that not only was this state-sponsored violence a contributor to segregation in Louisville, but there were hundreds of other cases like this. And I don't use this number exaggeratedly. There were hundreds of other cases of state-sponsored violence, police protection of mobs, sometimes police-led and organized mobs, to drive African Americans out of homes in the 20th century that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these hundreds of cases was a civil rights violation. Every one of them requires us as American citizens to remedy it. We've never accepted that obligation. And then I began to look into it further. And I found that there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, all of them racially explicit, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. The federal policies, state and local policies, racially explicit, were so powerful that they determine the racial landscape of today, the apartheid system under which we live. Well, let me give you an example of one that's very close to your work, an example of a federal policy that created the segregation that we know today. In the post-World War II period, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration implemented a program. The FHA had started it a bit before World War II, but intensified after the war, implemented a program to suburbanize the entire white population into single-family homes in all white suburbs that would exclude African Americans. This was a racially explicit policy. As you probably know, we weren't a suburban country at that time. The big suburbanization of this country took place after World War II into the 1950s and 60s. We were, at the time, in the post-World War II period, mostly an urban country. Both whites and African Americans lived in urban areas. We were a manufacturing economy. Factories had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. Workers typically didn't have automobiles to get to work. They walked to work or took short streetcar rides. Employees of banks and other service industries also had to live near these factories in downtown areas. So we had downtown areas in every metropolitan area of this country that had both blacks and whites living in them. The federal government, as I say, embarked on a program to move the entire white population out of these urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. We became a suburban country because of this policy, and you're familiar with them. The suburbs that were created all over the country in the 1940s, some before, some after, in the post-World War II period. The most famous of these, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in what was then a rural area east of New York. The builder, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to buy the land and build 17,000 homes for which he yet had no buyers. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money for such a speculative project. We weren't, as I said, a suburban country. The banks didn't think anybody would want to live in these places. The only way that William Levitt could get the funds get the capital to buy the land, build the homes until he actually sold them. The only way he could get that capital was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development. Excuse me. The architectural designs, the layout of the streets, the materials he was going to use, and a commitment required by the FHA and VA that he would never sell a home to an African American. The FHA and VA even required William Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans and rental to African Americans. This was a federal requirement. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was written in the federal policy manual, the federal underwriting manual distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not to recommend applications of developers for federally guaranteed bank loans. The manual said you couldn't recommend for a federally guaranteed bank loan the proposal of a developer who is going to sell to African Americans in a white neighborhood. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white development if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. No basis in reality to it whatsoever. It's something we've made up to avoid facing up to these facts. Well, the homes in Levittown and in communities all over this country that were created with the same FHA and VA policies were inexpensive. As I said, they were designed for working class, lower middle class families who were previously living in cities, returning war veterans. They sold at the time, in today's money, current dollars, in today's money, for about $100,000 a piece, these homes. Any working class family, anybody with a job in the post-war economy could afford to buy a home for $100,000 with an FHA mortgage, VA mortgage that would go out for 20 or 30 years. Both whites and African Americans could have afforded to move into these places. Whites did, African Americans are prohibited by federal policy from doing so. Well, those homes, as you know, better than anybody else, you know this, those homes in these suburbs no longer sell for $100,000. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places $1 million or more. The white families who bought those homes gained, over the course of the next couple of generations, wealth from the appreciation and the value of the homes, from the equity that they gained from this rapid price inflation of the homes in which they lived and which they had purchased inexpensively. The white families who gained this wealth, this equity, used it to send their children to college. They used it to take care of temporary emergencies, maybe unemployment, maybe medical emergencies. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this wealth-generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. That's a gap, big gap. I don't have time to describe its origins today. I do devote a small chapter in the Color of Law book to it. But that gap, you would think, would be comparable to the wealth gap. If there's a 60% family income ratio, African Americans can save the same amount of money from incomes as whites can. You would think that African American wealth would be about 60% of white wealth. But in fact, African American wealth today is only about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was implemented in the 20th century, and whose remedy we have never assumed an obligation to undertake because we have failed to face up to the unconstitutional way it was created. I'm not going to do this much, but I did notice in the chat someone asked what year Levittown was created. I should have mentioned that. It was in 1948, 49 was when the project was developed. Somebody said 1947, that's actually when the loan applications were made. Yeah. Well, there are many, many other policies that have created segregation, racially explicit policies. The wealth gap itself that I've been describing is responsible for much of the social problems and inequality we have in this country today. I've already described how that wealth gap is responsible in large part for the achievement gap in schools, because African-American families typically don't have the wealth to be able to move out of low-income neighborhoods where they're concentrated into neighborhoods where they have access to good schools that have high achievement, that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their children, where they have healthy air, where they have access to good jobs and transportation to those jobs. It's responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. As you know, African Americans have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease than whites because they live in neighborhoods where they're concentrated, more pollution, as I've said, no access to grocery stores selling healthy food. It's responsible in large part for the mass incarceration and abuse of young African American men by police. I'm not suggesting that no police officer would ever abuse a young man if it weren't for racial segregation, but it's much, much more intense because of it. If we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs or the transportation to get to them, or schools that aren't overwhelmed with the social and economic problems of their children, if we concentrate young men in those neighborhoods, it's inevitable that the police are going to engage in confrontations with them, that they'll adopt the tactics that they think are necessary to control a disadvantaged, restive population straining for opportunity. The tactics that police forces in this country use in low-income segregated neighborhoods are not much different from the tactics used by occupying forces in colonial countries in the 20th century, whether in India or the Congo or anywhere else. That's a result of racial segregation, of the concentration of the most disadvantaged African Americans in single neighborhoods, and the wealth gap that we created and the racial segregation that it supports is also responsible for something else that's very dangerous and frightening, and that is the very, very severe political polarization that we have in this country today. It's more severe, I think, than at any time since the 1850s that led to civil war. The political polarization is not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines, as we all know. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that's necessary to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other? We don't develop a common national identity in that way. Well, the policies to redress racial segregation are well known. No mystery about them. Policy experts, housing experts, journalists spin out ideas for things we can do to redress segregation every day. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement, like the one we had in the 1960s, that's going to raise the temperature of segregation by neighborhood and make it possible to begin to address the policies that are necessary to reverse it. I'm working now with a group of national civil rights leaders who are proposing to create something they call a new movement to redress racial segregation that will place some staff and communities around the country to try to create local groups that will redress segregation in their own communities. Until that happens, I don't expect much progress, although there are some hopeful efforts around the country of local governments taking steps to redress segregation. But let me describe to you a few of the policies, I say they're well known, that we should be implementing if we are serious about fulfilling our constitutional obligations to redress the unconstitutional racial boundaries that we've created. I mentioned Levittown. I could have mentioned any other of these suburbs that were created by the federal government. I've written a couple of articles about them. They're based on a new book I'm working on about how we redress segregation. For example, Levittown, as I said, those homes sold for $100,000 in today's money around the mid-20th century. They now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. As a result of the Fair Housing Act, which said, okay, African Americans, you're now permitted to live in Levittown. African Americans who could afford to buy those homes at those prices have moved in, and Levittown is now about 1% to 2% African American. In a broader neighborhood, that's about 12 to 13% African American. That's what you would expect Levittown to be if African Americans had been permitted to move into it when it was affordable. Well, the federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown when they come for sale at market rates, $300,000, $400,000, whatever, and reselling them to qualified African Americans at deeply discounted prices. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. We don't do it because we have blinded ourselves to the obligation to do it because we don't know the history of the unconstitutional way in which it was created. We have many other policies that we could do to move towards a more healthy, less segregated society. As you all know, and there's a lot of discussion about this in the press, one of the things that preserves our segregation is the zoning rules that in many all white, mostly white communities prohibit the construction of anything but townhouses or anything but single family homes on large lot sizes, no permission for townhouses, for garden apartments, for duplexes or triplexes. Those zoning rules exclude working class, middle class African Americans who cannot afford to move to those suburbs at current prices like the ones in Levittown that I described before. We should abolish those zoning rules, and we should have affirmative action programs that subsidize African Americans to move to the more affordable units that are then developed. As I say, the policies are well known. We need a new civil rights movement to make those policies viable. Thad, Kevin, I don't know what you like. We started a little bit late, but I wanted to leave time for questions. So maybe I'll stop there. I know that you've registered for this webinar, and I can send you some work I'm doing about these policies to redress segregation that comes out of the work for a new book I'm working on about policies to redress. So with that, let me try to take questions, and I can certainly talk for 3 years about this if you want me to, but I think I'd rather answer your questions if you have them. Yes, the latest question I saw in the chat was whether my new book is going to address this, and the answer is yes. My current book is about the history, and I think you need to learn the history in order to redress it. Perhaps the first thing that should be done in any community is ensuring that your local school districts are teaching this history accurately. We've created a curriculum unit that can be used in local schools, a short curriculum unit that addresses this history. Local groups and you should be pressing your local school districts to adopt a curriculum like this. And like I said, I can send it to you. It's free following this webinar. How are we going to handle the questions, Kevin?
So everyone, if you have questions, and thank you, Richard. If anyone that has questions, if you could pop open the Q&A section, that's the easiest way to review them. And that way Richard can keep them organized. The chat sometimes gets a little cluttered. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and then Richard can address them as we go.
Okay, well, the first question, as I see, is, do any of the affordable housing programs in place now address these issues? Well, yes. The biggest subsidy program we have for low-income families. When we talk about affordable housing, that's a euphemism. It really means of housing for the lowest income African Americans, disproportionately, Hispanics disproportionately. The biggest program we have for affordable housing is something called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a program administered by the U.S. Treasury Department that provides tax credits to states, which then distribute them to nonprofit organizations. The nonprofit organizations then sell them to developers, and they build affordable housing. By that, they mean the program means for families with incomes below 60% of the median income for a community. So these are not necessarily only poor people, which is much lower than 60% of area median income, but it is for low-income families. The problem with this program is that it reinforces segregation, because developers of affordable low-income housing would rather place those units in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. The land is cheaper in those segregated neighborhoods. They don't have to, if they're going to build a project there for low-income families, they don't have to hold 100 community meetings explaining why they're bringing Black and brown children into your community. Easy to rent apartments. They can put a sign in the window, and people walking by who are eligible can see that there's a vacancy. So developers would like to place those affordable housing units in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. There are some that are being placed in higher opportunity neighborhoods, and those begin to address this problem. And some communities are doing a better job of requiring that developers place those units in higher opportunity communities than other communities. And I don't know, I understand there are people from all over the country in this webinar. I see that there are 208 registered. So I don't know if in your community they're doing a better or worse job, but you should look into it. One of the other problems, though, with the low-income housing tax credit program is that middle-class, working-class families earn too much to be able to take advantage of this program, and too little to afford market rate units in these in higher opportunity communities. We don't have a federal subsidy program for working middle-class families, housing families, even though housing is becoming less and less affordable to them in many, many metropolitan areas. So we're making a little bit of progress with placing some of these units in higher opportunity communities. Some communities are doing a better job with it than others. Next question, what else can we do? I'm going to skip that one. I could talk for years. Let me just talk about some specific ones as I have been doing. Okay, the next question is, what can or should we do when I come across racist or biased deed restrictions when reviewing title when the client is purchasing a home? They are no longer enforceable, but how do they get removed? Well, you can't remove them. Let me begin by saying that. You can't change a title, as you know better than I do. You're all real estate brokers and agents. You can't change a title, a deed restriction in the title any more than you can change the property line. Once the title is created, it's permanent. What you can do is place an addendum, perhaps staple it over that racial clause. The addendum could say something like this: we recognize that this community once unconstitutionally excluded African Americans and other minorities from this community. We repudiate this clause. We're ashamed of it. We want to state in our title that we welcome people of all races and ethnicities into our community. That would be a good thing to do with those kinds of titles. There's a lot of attention to removing those titles. They can't be removed, as I say. You can cross them out. You can place which I favor, place an affirmative statement over it. But removing those restrictions doesn't create a single housing opportunity for a single African American. It's an important symbolic act, but it's not. It doesn't take the more important step of actually engaging in a program to open up the community where it exists. And that's what I think the new civil rights movement must do, and it's what I hope all of you will participate in if this new movement to redress racial segregation gets organized. All right, next question is, at a local government level, what can leaders do to right past and ongoing wrongs? Well, I mentioned one, modifying zoning rules to open up a community to people of diverse races and ethnicities by creating the opportunity to, I'm not talking about public housing, high-rise projects, I'm talking about duplexes, townhouses, missing middle-income housing. I'm sure you've heard that term, that would be more affordable. It would still probably require subsidies for working class families and disproportionately African American because of this history I described. But that's one thing a local government can do. I also mentioned that a local government can recruit low-income housing tax credit units into higher opportunity communities. We have a program, you've probably heard of it, the Section 8 Voucher Program. The Section 8 Voucher Program also presently reinforces segregation because the amount of the voucher is calculated on the area median rent in a particular large metropolitan area. As you can understand, the median rent is too low to afford to rent an apartment in a high opportunity community where rents are higher. It's actually too high to rent an apartment in a low opportunity community where rents are lower, a segregated community. Landlords in those segregated communities exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise bear. There is an experimental program that some public housing agencies have implemented to adjust the amount of the voucher to make it higher if it's used in a higher opportunity community and lower if it's used in an existing segregated community. Your local public housing authority could implement that program in your area as well. I mentioned a minute ago, probably the first step that any local government at the local level can do, and that is start teaching this history accurately to our young people. Because if the current generation doesn't learn the history, the unconstitutionality of our segregated patterns any better than our generation has learned it, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. So the first step, I think, is to teach this history accurately, and the local school district can undertake that kind of program. Well, can I talk a bit more about the policies that have worked? Well, all the things I've talked about so far are being tried in various places to a very small extent. There are, I can give you an example. Probably maybe some of you are from Montgomery County in Maryland, outside Washington. Montgomery County has a what's called an inclusionary zoning program, where any new development, whether of single-family homes or of duplexes or garden apartments, any new development has to set aside 1/3 of its units for moderate income families, which are far below the kinds of families that presently live in Montgomery County. And then the Public Housing Authority of Montgomery County purchases 1/3 of those set-aside units for public housing residents. So you have projects that are truly mixed income. They have both market rate families, moderate income families, workforce families, and low income families. What the research shows, and it's not surprising, what the research shows is that the public housing residents who are placed in units in these otherwise diverse developments, their children do much, much better in school because they're not attending schools that are overwhelmed with children who have social and economic disadvantages. Their children do much better in school than comparable children who live in public housing projects without this opportunity. So that's one example that's worked. I've already mentioned a couple of others. Do I believe reparations are part of the solution to undo some of the damage done by these policies? I don't use the term reparations. Most people misunderstand the term when it's used, so I don't think it's helpful. I think it's misleading. Most people think of reparations as a single monetary payment to the current generation of African Americans. That monetary payment would inevitably be too small to solve this enormous problem. The problem is going to take several generations to solve, even if we were aggressive at solving it. So a payment to the current generation would not solve it. What it would do is it would give people an excuse not to look at policies that we need to implement in order to redress segregation, because they'll say, well, we've settled this problem, we've paid the reparations, now let's move on. I prefer to talk about policies and programs, as I have been, that are going to redress segregation. If you want to call them reparations, you can, but I think most people will misunderstand that term. But we need to really talk about specific policies and programs that we can implement, for which, as I said, there's generally no political support at this time, but for which we need to generate the support, and I'm hoping that you'll help do it. Oh, yeah, this question, I'm not going to say much about this. Have I heard about Bruce's Beach in California? Yes, this is a property that was seized from an African American family on the beachfront of California. I believe it was Manhattan Beach was the community. Worth much, much more today than it was when it was seized from this family. There's an effort made to make it return to this family, but that's not really a model for much else. It's a very unique situation. I certainly think that it's the right thing to do, but it's not going to do much to desegregate the Los Angeles area. Well, what is the most important? This is a good question. What is the most important thing we as brokers can do to help desegregate our cities? Well, let me begin by saying the National Association of Realtors has a very, I think, wrong-headed attitude towards the Fair Housing Act that it promotes to all of you. It says, like the Supreme Court, that the way to pursue fair housing is never to mention race, to pretend that race doesn't exist. That's not what the Fair Housing Act requires, and that's not what the Constitution requires. What the Constitution and the Fair Housing Act require is that you affirmatively promote desegregation. That when white families come to look for a home, you try to encourage them to look at a neighborhood that's desegregated or that is desegregated. You tell them their children, which is accurate, that their children will do much better in schools, not if they have high test scores. That's easy. They'll do much better in schools if they become accustomed to having schoolmates from diverse backgrounds, because then they'll be accustomed to work in a diverse workforce in the 21st century. So that's something that's obviously we need to eliminate the steering. I'm sure you're all familiar with that Long Island Newsday expose of the real estate industry in Long Island. If you're not, I can send it to you, but there's obviously a lot of steering that continues to go on, steering white families to white neighborhoods, black families to black neighborhoods in the real estate industry. That needs to be ended. But in addition to ending it, we need to affirmatively promote desegregated neighborhoods. One of the disastrous consequences of that law that I talked about at the very beginning of my talk, the No Child Left Behind law, is it gave excessive attention to test scores. And the real estate industry generally, brokers, sites like Zillow and great schools promote test scores as an indication of the quality of a neighborhood. And this is one of the things that has increased segregation in the last few years. Families looking for homes think that a neighborhood that has higher test scores is a better neighborhood. It's a place where they should settle. High test scores are primarily the result of the background of the children, the social and economic background of the children who attend schools. A school in a suburban neighborhood with high numbers of college graduates as parents, that school is going to get high test scores no matter how bad the school is. There are much better schools, in many cases, that have lower test scores, that do much more to improve the diverse skills that a child needs than schools with high test scores. So I think the two things that the brokers can do is, one, aggressively promote non-segregated neighborhoods, and secondly, stop using test scores as the indicator of a good neighborhood, a high quality neighborhood. Well, can I suggest ways in which we can actively engage in these efforts? Yes, as I mentioned, I'll send you a link where you can sign up for this new movement to redress racial segregation. I know that there are many people from other walks of life in your community. You mentioned you live and work in Asheville. There are already people from Asheville who have signed up to want to create such a local committee. If you sign up, you will be put in touch with them, and perhaps you can create a local committee that's going to begin to address some of these issues. These questions are. No, there was no. The question was there a law with regard to the example I gave at the beginning about the Louisville, Kentucky situation? There was no law that required segregation, but our Constitution does not just prohibit explicit laws. It prohibits the actions of federal government or state government or local government to violate civil rights. So when the police enforced racial segregation in Louisville, that had the effect of law. In fact, the title of my book, it's The Color of Law, and the police were acting under color of law to create that racial segregation. So you don't need an explicit law to implement an unconstitutional policy. Anytime federal, state, or local governments violate civil rights, it's a violation of the Constitution. And it says unconstitutional is a law that explicitly requires that. Oh, I'm sorry. Kevin, you said you wanted to come in and answer a question. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I just wanted to add something really quickly about schools. You were talking about test scores being a metric that great schools and other sites use. I want to point out that it's a Chicago-based company. They've started something called schoolsparrow.com that takes other metrics. And what they've done is they've taken test scores out of the leading indicator for what the best schools are, because they found that there's a correlation between test scores and familial income. And that doesn't dictate the success or the quality of the school. So we're actually doing a webinar with them next Wednesday, 1 week from today. So,
oh, terrific! If you send me some information about that program, I would very much appreciate it.
Absolutely, I'll put it in the chat for everyone, and then as a follow-up, I know Richard's going to send something out, and I'll include information about our webinar next week.
Good, that's terrific. Well, I think we're out of time, but I will send follow-up information. I am writing a new book, as I said, on of what we can do to redress segregation. I will send you some articles I've written out of the work for that new book, as well as information about the sign up for the new movement to redress racial segregation, just to get information about it. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. And it was a pleasure being with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Incredibly grateful to have you with us. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for all the research and all the work that you're doing. And we look forward to receiving the follow-up too, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Make it a great Wednesday, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.